This is Pat Tormey, and welcome to How Do I Winforms Using Bindable Objects. Okay, so the question is, what is a bindable object? And I'll start by telling you what I mean to do is to take an object of my own creation and bind it to something like, for example, this data grid, in such a way that the data grid itself will be able to update two ways with the bindable object. So I want to be able to read it and write it back. Now to do that, of course, I'm going to need some sort of an object. So I have one stashed here for you. What I did is in the same class that I have the form, I created a class called OrderData. If you need to see how classes are created, we have other videos on that. What's interesting about this one is I've decided to use Nullable Types, and that's another video I've done on Nullable Types. You might want to check that out. But essentially it says that the quantity is going to be accepted as a nullable of integer, meaning that it can be specified later. That the price is a decimal, but it's not nullable. The extended price, of course, is what happens if you multiply the quantity times the price each, and that would be a nullable result. In this case, it's a nullable of decimal. And order date, in my fantasy order data scheme here, I'm saying that the order date is going to go in as nullable. That's what the question mark means. And that later I can calculate inside the class, we're going to ship it 30 days from now. Okay, so you don't need to see all the details, but we'll walk through and show you anyway. I have my item name there, which is public property read-write. And you've seen all this before. I have a public property for the price each. Where things get a little tricky, here's the quantity, and of course he's now of type nullable integer. I'll hover over that and show you. And then I can come down here and show you that the order date is also nullable, meaning it need not be specified. Ship date is nullable. Ship date, however, what I'm going to do is create a variable here called ship date that's of type nullable of date. And then I'm going to say that if it has the order date has a value, then I'm going to take the order date and calculate 1 month on that, add them together, and return a ship date. So this thing here, when you ask for a ship date, if there is an order date, it will be 30 days from then, and if there is not, it will return nullable of date time. So that's all we've done that's particularly tricky. The extended price here is going to be, again, nullable. And I'm just going to multiply the two. This is not a section on how to build classes or how to use the nullable type. What we're looking at is how do I bind this to a grid. I've made a private sub new that prevents somebody from creating one without actually instantiating it with an item name and a unit price. Okay, so you'd think that that would be fairly easy. All I have to do is once I create that thing, come up with some way to create a bunch of them. So again, I'm going to use the generic types, which I'm becoming very fond of, and let me show you how that's done. I'm going to create a new modular-wide public variable on end of the class. List, and then since it's list of t, I can say order data. Alright, and you'd think all I'd have to do there is actually go ahead and populate this somehow, and I can do that by saying that I want to add something to my list. Dot add, and in this case I'm just going to say it's going to be a new order data. And order data wants to see what kind of thing it is, so its name is going to be apples. Its name is going to be apples, and its unit price is going to be $1. Okay, so that's one thing I can have on my order. Let me complete that. There you go. And moving on that way, I can add bananas and oranges just as easily. And there you have it, my short list. Now, all I need to do to bind that is to say me dot data grid view dot data source equals the products list. And there you have it. Alright, so that looks like it ought to be pretty good, because after all it's allowed to be set as a source. It happens to be a list of a particular type using my generics. We know it's already going to be orders. I've added a few orders to it, and let's just see how that runs. And it pops up, and I say, okay, there's my apples and my oranges and my bananas. Well, if I put quantity in here, I'll say, well, let's give me 50. We know that should come to $50, right? But it didn't. I come over here and I say, well, let me give you 10 oranges and 5 bananas. So why didn't anything happen? Well, it turns out I have to come over here and refresh it. And the reason I have to click on this to refresh it is because at the time I put the 50 in there, the grid itself didn't really realize that it was being bound to anything in particular. This went back into the class, the instance of the class, updated the quantity of apples, and did in fact recalculate the unit price, but then he just didn't tell anybody about it. So we don't need that. So I can put in an order date here, and we'll make it and you'll see we have exactly the same issue. He'll calculate the order date only after I come back and request something from the underlying data structure. So that's not exactly the behavior we're looking for, and this is where bindable objects can solve the problem. I'll drop this, and let's go take a look at bindable objects. So like I always try to do, I want to give you a reference, and this is to how to implement the iNotify property changed interface. Read that article in MSDN, and you'll have a pretty good start. The first thing I have to do is I want to go over here and say that instead of just using a list, I want to use a bindable list. And the first thing he tells me to do is to make this list not just a vanilla list, but to make it a binding list. And you'd think that would make him happy, but I need to bring in a reference. Since binding list isn't available, I'll tell it to go ahead and import system component model. And now we have a binding list. So now when this thing connects up, at least it's binding. But what it doesn't do for us, at least it hasn't done yet, is to tell me what it would actually do to notify you that the event had happened. So let's come down here and take a look at a couple things. What am I going to do when I do, how will I notify you that I have something to change? Something needs to be changed. Well, let's first start by saying that this class itself needs to implement the iNotify change property. Just typing that in does a couple things for me. It actually, down the bottom here, in my same class, it added in the property changed event where I can have a sender and an event argument. Okay, so if I need to let somebody know that something's changed and a property's changed, all I have to do is tell which property has changed. Well, the properties that can change are the ones I calculate. So I have the quantity could change, and if the quantity changes, I want to let people know that that also changes the extended price. Now that I've implemented the property change event, I'm going to give you a little nugget you'll find right here and a reference to it. And if you follow that link in MSDN, it suggests you wrap the notify property changed with a more simpler way of calling it, so it'll raise the event that property changed down below. You see, this thing is just a wrapper for that. So now I can make simpler handling of where I have to change, notify people that things have changed. I need to let people know the quantity changed, and the extended price has to be recalculated because that'll change. And of course, I have exactly the same issue when it comes to the order date. And I'll drop that one below where the value is changed. So now I say if the order date is changed, then so should the ship date. And that should do it for me. So you see what's going on here is I have this class, and the class is of my own design. It's got some values in there that may or may not be calculated. And I want to implement the iNotify property change event. And the reason for that is because then when I bind it as a binding list, it'll notify whoever called it, in this case it's going to be my data grid source, that the underlying data has changed, causing the data grid to refresh itself. Now let's see how it works. Okay, now I'll put my quantity in here. I'll buy 10. And as you see, my extended price kicks it out, make that 20. I'll have an order date of today. And I got a ship date. Everything happens automatically now because that's exactly the behavior I was looking for. Okay, this is Pat Tormey, and you've been watching How Do I Bindable Objects. And particularly what we're looking at here is how to use the services already built into .NET for a binding list, and how to use the iNotify property changed to make sure anybody using this object is aware of underlying value change without them having to explicitly go and refresh it. This is Pat Tormey, and thanks for watching.